Imagine a king chosen by God, yet slowly drifting from the very voice that made him ruler. Imagine a nation trembling, a prophet grieving, and one decision reshaping Israel's future. This is the story of Saul: promise, pressure, fear, and the quiet tragedy of a heart that stops listening. Tonight, we step into the early days of his reign and watch the moment where everything begins to change. Israel had long begged for a king. They wanted someone to fight their battles, someone to represent them, someone to look like the rulers of other nations. God granted their request, though he warned them that a king would come with burdens. Through Samuel, he chose Saul, tall, impressive, humble at first, and filled with potential. But calling is only the beginning. What truly shapes a life is the heart behind it. And now our story opens at a moment when the first cracks in Saul's foundation begin to show. Saul, once the humble young man searching for his father's donkeys, was now king of a people who had spent generations longing for stability and generations trembling before enemies stronger than themselves. Saul gathered 3,000 chosen men of Israel. 2,000 stayed with him in the hills around Michmash and the highlands of Bethel, where the wind carried the sound of distant movement and the land stretched in long, rolling ridges. The other 1,000 served under his son Jonathan in Gibeah, a place of stone paths, olive groves, and watchful silence. Jonathan was young, courageous, clear-sighted. If Saul's reign rested on uncertain foundations, Jonathan's heart stood steady like a rooted tree. He looked at the Philistine garrison in Geba, not with fear, but with conviction. And one day, with the quiet determination of someone who knows that waiting can sometimes be the greatest danger, he attacked. The Philistine outpost fell. A spark had been lit, and sparks can be beautiful or they can ignite storms. When the Philistines heard what happened, their response was swift and overwhelming. Their dominance in the region was no secret. Years of oppression had ensured that Israel remained subdued, weaponless, and dependent. Jonathan's attack shook that balance, and Saul, wanting to rally the nation, ordered the trumpet to be blown throughout the land. Let all Israel hear, Saul has struck the Philistine garrison. The sound of the trumpet carried far, echoing across hills, drifting through villages, and reaching the ears of farmers, shepherds, and warriors. But instead of courage, it awakened fear. Because soon after the trumpet, rumors began to travel. The Philistines were gathering, not hundreds, not a modest force, but thousands, chariots with iron-bound wheels, horsemen with polished armor catching the sunlight, and foot soldiers as numerous as the sand beside the sea. Israel's heart sank, and the land braced for the shock that would follow. As the Philistine army assembled at Michmash, the Israelites looked around at their villages, their tools, their empty forges. There were no blacksmiths in Israel. The Philistines had ensured that long ago, leaving Israel almost entirely without swords or spears. What they held in their hands were plows and sickles, axes and crude knives, tools for living, not for war. Fear spread like a cold wind. Men hid in caves, squeezing between stones and shadows. Others slipped into thickets, lying flat among roots and leaves. Some crawled into dry pits and cisterns, clinging to the damp earth as if it could swallow their fear. Others fled across the Jordan River, abandoning the land they loved. Those who stayed with Saul trembled, and Saul felt the weight of a kingdom pressing on his chest. Samuel, the prophet who anointed Saul, had given clear instructions. "Wait for me 7 days in Gilgal, I will come. I will offer sacrifices. I will seek the Lord's favor." 7 days, a simple instruction, or so it seemed. But waiting is never simple when fear swells around you. Saul waited. With every sunrise, more soldiers slipped away. He watched his army shrink like water trickling from a cracked jar. By the morning of the 7th day, the Philistines looked unstoppable. Their camp in Michmash was like a living storm, dust stirring, armor clinking, voices rising like distant thunder. And the people of Israel stared at Saul with wide, questioning eyes. Their fear soaked into Saul's heart. By late afternoon of the 7th day, the prophet still had not arrived. Saul felt the weight of time pressing against him. Finally, under the crushing pressure of fear, Saul spoke the fateful words, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." His men hesitated. They knew the offering belonged to Samuel, but Saul insisted. And so he stepped forward, lit the fire, and offered the sacrifice. And in that moment, just as he finished, the figure of Samuel appeared on the horizon. Samuel walked toward Saul with slow, steady steps. He looked older, warier, and there was a sadness in his eyes that Saul didn't immediately understand. "What have you done?" Samuel asked, not with anger, with grief, like someone watching a friend walk willingly into a fall. Saul rushed to defend himself. "My men were scattering. You didn't come when you promised. The Philistines were assembling. I felt compelled to offer the sacrifice." But Samuel shook his head. "You have acted foolishly. If you had obeyed the command of the Lord, he would have established your kingdom forever. But now your kingdom will not endure." Saul's heart thudded. The world seemed to grow still around him. "The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart," Samuel continued, "and appointed him ruler over his people." Saul stood there, surrounded by 600 trembling men, listening to the quiet collapse of his legacy. He did not yet know the name David. But destiny had already begun shifting toward Bethlehem. Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah. Saul counted the men who still remained, a mere 600. The Philistines still occupied the high ground, their outposts standing like watchful eyes across the valley. Israel had no weapons except those held by Saul and Jonathan. No blacksmiths, no reinforcements, no strategic advantage. Everything seemed to be slipping through Saul's hands. But God had not abandoned Israel. He would simply work through the one heart in that camp that still trusted him, Jonathan. While Saul remained in Gibeah, sitting beneath a pomegranate tree on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by soldiers who weren't sure whether to hope or despair, Jonathan rose quietly at dawn. The air was cool. A thin mist rested in the valleys. Birdsong drifted softly from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the Philistine camp stirred like a living giant. Jonathan turned to his young armor-bearer, faithful, loyal, eager. "Come," Jonathan whispered. "Let us go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." He did not tell his father. not out of rebellion, but because Saul's heart was tangled in fear, and fear never understands faith. Jonathan and his armor-bearer began their journey toward the Philistine outpost, walking between two rocky cliffs, Bozez on one side, Seneh on the other. The rocks towered like ancient guardians, their shadows stretching across the path. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones. But Jonathan walked steadily, the way someone walks who feels God close behind them. When they reached a vantage point, Jonathan stopped and looked ahead. "Let us go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised Philistines," he said softly. "It may be that the Lord will act for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." The armor-bearer's answer came with devotion. "Do all that is in your heart. I am with you, heart and soul." 2 men against an army. But Jonathan knew something Saul did not. Faith can open doors that armies cannot. Jonathan proposed a simple sign. "We will show ourselves to the Philistines. If they say, 'Wait until we come to you,' we will stay where we are. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then that will be the sign that the Lord has delivered them into our hand." They stepped from behind the rocks, exposed, visible, vulnerable. The Philistines spotted them and laughed. "Look, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes where they've been hiding." Then the soldiers at the outpost shouted, "Come up to us, and we will show you something." Jonathan turned to his armor-bearer. "This is the sign," he whispered. "The Lord has given them into Israel's hand." With hands and feet they climbed the cliff, stones scraping beneath their palms, dust rising around their legs. When they reached the top, the first Philistine charged. Jonathan struck him down. The second fell to the armor-bearer. Then another, and another. Within moments, 20 soldiers fell on a small patch of ground, a miracle unfolding in silence and dust. As Jonathan's sword cut through the tension of the moment, something unseen began to stir. The earth trembled, just slightly at first, like the soft beginning of a distant quake, then stronger, rippling through the Philistine camp. Men stumbled, horses neighed in confusion, chariots rattled, shouts rose, fear spread like wildfire. The Philistines looked around and saw enemies everywhere, even among their own ranks. In their confusion, they turned against one another, swords flashing, panic roaring through the camp like a windstorm. Saul's lookouts in Gibeah saw the chaos unfolding. The vast Philistine camp was collapsing into disorder, shifting, trembling, falling apart. Saul called out, "Number the men and see who is missing." And the answer returned, Jonathan and his armor-bearer. In that moment, it became clear. God was moving through the faith of 2 men. Saul quickly prepared to join the battle. The scattered Israelites, who had hidden in caves and behind rocks, sensed the turn of events. They came rushing back, joining the fight with renewed courage. Those who had even fled across the Jordan returned. All of Israel surged forward, like water swelling into a riverbed, rushing together toward victory. And so, through a miracle that started with 2 faithful hearts, the Lord rescued Israel that day. But in the midst of this unfolding victory, Saul made a tragic mistake. Driven by pride and a desire for revenge, he placed the entire nation under a harsh oath. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. Not Israel's enemies, my enemies, Saul said. And so the people fought all day without nourishment. Their hands shook, their legs weakened. The sun climbed higher, turning the ground hot beneath their feet and the air thick around them. Jonathan, who had not heard the oath, walked through a forest where honey glistened on the ground, golden, warm, shimmering in the sun. He dipped the end of his staff into it and tasted the sweetness. Instantly, his eyes brightened, his strength returned, his body revived. But when the soldiers warned him of the oath, Jonathan shook his head gently. My father has troubled the land, he said with quiet sadness. See how my strength returned with just a little honey? How much greater our victory would have been if the people had eaten freely today. Jonathan saw what Saul could not. Victory is not built on fear. By the end of the day, the people were faint. So faint that when evening came and the oath lifted, they rushed upon the livestock taken from the Philistines. In their desperation, they slaughtered the animals on the ground and ate them with the blood, a violation of God's law. Saul blamed the people, not realizing that his own oath had driven them to this moment of weakness. He hurried to build an altar, the first he ever built to the Lord. But it was an altar born of panic, not devotion. Later, Saul wanted to continue pursuing the Philistines at night. But when he inquired of the Lord, there was no answer. Saul concluded that someone had sinned, and in his rigid, fear-driven state, he vowed, Even if the sin lies with Jonathan, my son, he shall surely die. Lots were cast, first between the people and Saul's family. The lot fell on Saul and Jonathan. Again, lots were cast, and Jonathan was chosen. Saul turned to his son. What have you done? Jonathan, calm and honest, replied, I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die. Saul lifted his hand, his face carved with stubbornness. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not put to death today. But the people, exhausted, grateful, clear-eyed, stepped forward. No, they declared. Not one hair of Jonathan's head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God today. They ransomed Jonathan, delivering him from the very oath his father had foolishly spoken. Saul backed down, unable to stand against the united will of the people. And the fighting ceased. The day was saved not by the king's commands, but in spite of them, through the quiet courage of a young man who trusted the Lord with unwavering faith. Time passed after the events with Jonathan. Israel enjoyed a period of relative calm, yet underneath the surface lay the unspoken tension between Saul and the prophet Samuel. One day Samuel arrived before Saul once more. The old prophet's face carried lines carved by years of leadership, prayer, and sorrow. His eyes still held the quiet fire of conviction. He stood before the king and said, Listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them on their way from Egypt. Now go, Attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them." Saul nodded, but deep within him something remained unsettled, something restless, something always reaching for control. Saul gathered the people at Telling. The dust rose beneath thousands of feet. Men with shields, men with slings, shepherds turned soldiers, farmers carrying spears fashioned from old tools. 210,000 armed men stood ready. It was one of the largest forces Saul had ever assembled. Before the battle, Saul sent warning to the Kenites, friends and allies of Israel, descendants of Moses' father-in-law. "Go away from among the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you with them." Saul's voice carried over the plains, respectful, measured, protective of those who had shown kindness. The Kenites moved away quickly, disappearing among the rocky hills. And then the campaign began. Saul struck the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, an enormous stretch of land extending toward Egypt. Step by step, village by village, Saul's forces overwhelmed the Amalekites. The earth shook with the rhythm of marching feet. Dust rose like a veil across the landscape. The cries of battle echoed between the hills. And when the fighting ended, Saul stood victorious. But victory is not always obedience. For instead of following the Lord's command entirely, Saul and the people spared Agag, the Amalekite king. Agag, robed in linen dyed with deep colors, bearing jewelry that marked his status, was taken alive. And the people kept the best of the sheep, the oxen, the lambs, animals plump and healthy, perfect for sacrifice or wealth. To them, it seemed reasonable. To them, it seemed practical. To them, it seemed even religious. But obedience is not measured by what seems right to us. It is measured by what God said. And God had said, "Leave nothing." Yet Saul kept what appealed to the eye. That night, long before dawn brushed the sky, the Lord spoke to Samuel. "I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my commands." The words tore at Samuel's heart. The old prophet rose from his bed, pacing back and forth in his room, lit only by a flickering oil lamp. He lifted his arms. He cried out to the Lord until morning, his voice breaking the quiet of the night. He mourned Saul because he saw the slow unraveling of a man who once walked humbly. Samuel had anointed Saul with his own hands. He had believed the best about him. He had hoped Saul would become a king who walked closely with God. And now Samuel wept all night long. At sunrise, Samuel set out to find Saul. He was told, "Saul has gone to Carmel. He has set up a monument in his own honor." A monument, a pillar of pride rising toward the sky. A sign that Saul saw the victory as his own achievement. Samuel's heart sank. When he finally approached Saul, the king stepped forward with open arms, smiling broadly. "Blessed be you of the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord." But Samuel's face remained still, unreadable. "What then?" Samuel asked. "Is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul's smile stiffened as he explained quickly. "Oh, the people spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we destroyed the rest." Even in his explanation, Saul revealed something. He called the Lord your God, not my God. Distance had already crept in between him and the one who placed him on the throne. Samuel lifted his hand gently. Stop. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Saul swallowed, suddenly uncertain. Speak, he said. Samuel's eyes held sorrow more than anger. Though you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over his people. He sent you on a mission saying, completely destroy the Amalekites. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the Lord's sight? Saul's defense came again, hurried and fragile. I did obey. I went on the mission. I destroyed the Amalekites. Agag I brought back alive, but only so the people could offer sacrifices. Samuel's voice softened, but carried weight like stone sinking into water. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying his voice? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is like idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Something broke inside Saul. I have sinned, he said, but please honor me before the elders of my people. Come back with me so I may worship the Lord your God. Saul feared the loss of his image more than the loss of God's presence. Samuel looked at him, grief in his gaze, and agreed, for the sake of the nation's unity, not for Saul's honor. But Samuel knew the truth. The kingdom had already begun shifting to hands unseen. Samuel then asked for Agag to be brought before him. Agag approached cautiously, saying, Surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel knew that incomplete obedience had no place in God's justice. As your sword has made women childless, he said, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel carried out what Saul would not. He finished the judgment pronounced by God. Then Samuel turned away from Saul. He returned to Ramah, his home, his sanctuary, the place where he prayed and taught and wept. Saul went back to Gibeah. And the scripture says, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but he mourned for him. Their paths parted, never to meet again. The chapter closes not with anger, but with sorrow. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. The king who had begun with such promise now stood alone, separated from the prophet who once believed in him with a father's heart. Saul returned to Gibeah to continue his reign, but something essential had slipped from his grasp. God's favor and the steady guidance that once shaped his path. And so this chapter ends not with triumph, but with a soft, solemn truth. Saul was still king, but the Lord had already turned his eyes toward another heart. The curtain closes gently, and a new chapter waits beyond the horizon. A chapter involving a shepherd boy not yet called from the fields. And now, dear friend, let your mind settle as this chapter of Saul's story gently closes. You have traveled far through ancient days. Now rest, breathe softly, and let sleep come to you like a quiet gift. Good night, and sleep well.